Welcome to the podcast about venture capital, where investors and founders alike can learn how VCs make decisions and reach conviction. Your host is Nick Moran, and this is the Full Ratchet.
Welcome back to TFR. On today's special segment, we ask guests to discuss the factor that could cause the most disruption to the industry going forward and how that will change the next decade of venture. Here's the segment called Disruptive Forces. On today's special segment, we have David Garcia of Digit. David, what factor could cause the most disruption or changes to fintech, and how will that make the next 10 years look different than the last 10?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most obvious answer, and it's AI. But I would say AI has already been transforming fintech for many years now. It's not only LLMs and all of the potential of LLMs, but like all of what has done in terms of machine learning for underwriting, collections, and many areas in financial services. But I think now this new set of tools with Gen AI and LLMs could definitely result in the most cost efficient and the most profitable financial companies that we have seen in history. And hopefully that can result in the best products for consumers as a result as well. And beyond that, I would say that it's also very interesting to see everything that's going on around pay by bank. Many people think that Visa's and MasterCard's business models will finally be disrupted. I think that's yet to be seen. I wouldn't bet strongly on that, but it's definitely very interesting to see all of the products and new technologies and that could be developed with these new rails.
On today's special segment, we have Bradley Tusk of Tusk Ventures. Bradley, what factor could cause the most disruption to the VC industry, and how will that make the next 10 years of VC look different than the last 10?
Yeah, so one, as we discussed, an unrealized gain tax would just be absolutely debilitating. Two, I think, would be what happens with interest rates and whether we ever get back to sort of a zero rate environment again. And it's going to have a huge impact either way, right? So what we saw is with interest rates at 6%, 7%, all of that, liquidity was terrible. M&A activity was bad for a bunch of reasons, but that was certainly one of them. IPOs were few and far between. Now, a zero rate environment may also be problematic, right? Because when WeWork is valued at $47 billion, or the fuck Maso did it on the back of a napkin, that's also bad. And so the question to me is, what's that number that will promote investment and liquidity and M&A and IPOs, and at the same time not have that irrational exuberance Alan Greenspan talked about that sort of leads to really bad decision making, overvaluation of companies, tremendous greed and everything else. And so the Fed is going to be a huge part of this. And honestly, we were talking earlier about Trump and Harris. One reason why, to me, Harris is a safer choice is I think she'd probably reappoint Jerome Powell. And I think generally speaking, a steady hand at the Fed is critical. And the problem with Trump is, he could appoint someone good, but you just have no idea. He's such a wild card. He's such a maverick that, when it's chaos all the time, he's going to appoint someone who he thinks is good for him personally, Donald Trump, not what's good for the economy as a whole. And if the Fed gets all screwed up, and as a result, interest rates, either go wildly in the wrong direction or being cut or raised for purely political purposes, that screws up everything. And so I think who is going to run the Fed is a really critical outcome.
On today's special segment, we have Ted Seides of Capital Allocators. Ted, what factor could cause the most disruption to allocation or private equity? And how will that make the next 10 years look different than the last 10?
So allocation, private equity, quite different. I think
Yes.
On the allocation side, it's impossible to go through your day-to-day without thinking that there's some AI bot somewhere that's going to figure out stuff that you haven't. I don't know yet, how that could impact that process of allocation. But even if you think about allocation to private equity, and I alluded to this earlier, there are data sets available that could be pretty darn indicative of okay, there's returns from Blackstone, fine. But Blackstone's made of a bunch of people. People are on deal teams. which deal teams were successful? How'd they find those deals? What happened to the companies when they owned them? And is there a pattern within that would tell you, no, it's those two people, Jane and John at Blackstone, who are the drivers of returns. And an individual, if you have a lot of data, might be able to figure that out. Is that something someday that could become like automated? I have no idea, but you certainly seen in the public markets with increased availability of data, more and more efficiency. And sometimes that drives inefficiency, but it tends to be in pockets. Whereas when I started my career, it was a joke if you couldn't beat the market because most of the people were doing stupid things. And if you understood what you're doing, you couldn't. Maybe that happens in the private markets. Private equity side, I imagine it's the same thing because private equity firms own businesses and businesses are facing, depending on what they're doing and what that future is, we're all facing a future driven by AI that we don't really know what it looks like. And even a business like Google, where 3 years ago we would have all said, boy, that search is an inalienable moat. It's not that it's not, but you have to scratch your head and say, well, is like Perplexity going to be a better search engine than Google in the future? I don't know. But there's actually a potential threat to Google's golden goose of search.
So great insights. And like your point around Blackstone and like who's, the winning team there and how do we discover them? It makes me think about a conversation I had with an old boss from Danaher about the system versus the people, right? And some have built this great system, can plug good people into it, and those people can be very successful regardless. And then some people, it's more about the people that are in it than the system. And they can go anywhere and be successful. But we've seen examples where you take, like in sports, for instance, you take a Russell Wilson out of Seattle, you put him in Denver, and he's no longer very successful, right? And so there's kind of this interesting question, and one that, I've grappled with, is it the people or the system, and how do those two things interact?
Yeah. It's funny. I just did a podcast with Mike Maples at Floodgate.
Yeah.
Who's written this book, Pattern Breakers. And it was his attempt to look at venture and say, okay, I know we've been successful, in air quotes. Have we been lucky or skillful? And he came out of it with at least a framework for thinking about what types of companies are more likely to be breakout successes in the venture world. And I haven't heard of anything like it before as he lays it out. It's an incredibly insightful framework for thinking about, like these types of companies that fit these types of characteristics seem to be ones that are the big breakout winners. The fascinating concept of like, how do we know, is it the system or is it the person?
It's fascinating. I just saw a post the other day on LinkedIn from one of the founders of Alpaca, which is like a seed fund in New York. And he was talking about all these insights from all this data from a few funds over the years. And one of his key takeaways was the selection process. I don't really have anything to share on that. It's kind of a crapshoot, but all the other stuff, the sourcing and the helping of companies, he had, really good feedback on. It was kind of interesting. That will conclude this installment of Investor Stories. If you're enjoying the program and would like to see it continue, take a moment and leave a 5-star review in iTunes. Okay, that will wrap things up for today. Until next time, over-prepare, choose carefully, and invest confidently. Thanks for joining me.